The perfect will theodicy is a response to the problem of evil and suffering. It's an original theodicy of my own, but it's influenced by some other theodicies, in particular from Thomas Ord, Kirk McGregor, and Eric Reeton. In this video, I'll be explaining the theodicy and responding to some objections against it. I've made a number of videos about this argument before, but I hope this one clarifies some of the points in further detail. Keep in mind that the goal of a theodicy is to propose a theory that demonstrates that there's no contradiction or likely incompatibility between the existence of a perfect God and the existence of suffering. The goal of a theodicy is not to prove that its claims are true, only that they're plausible given the assumptions of theism and one's theology. Now I will explain the theodicy. The perfect will theodicy argues that the laws of physics necessarily form an interconnected system for a given universe. In creating the universe, God conforms the interconnected system of laws to his intellect and will to order the laws to bring about his intentions. Now, if the system of laws is fully conformed to God's intellect and will, then the system of laws will bring about a universe that God fully desires, which is one where people don't suffer and are fully benefited. It will also be a universe where people desire to be in a perfect relation with God and one another, and so necessarily fully love God and one another, because this too is what an all-loving God would plausibly desire. But if God intentionally created people in an immediate perfect relation with God and one another, then this would arguably amount to a coerced, forced relationship, which would violate people's autonomy. To use an analogy, imagine if there was a machine that could make a person fall in love with another person. It would seem to violate someone's autonomy to use this machine on someone without their consent. But God, being fully loving and just, would not be able to intentionally violate the autonomy of his creatures, and so would need to create them initially in a universe where they are not in an immediate perfect relation with God and others, with the plan for them to be able to freely journey toward a perfect relation with God and others. Thereby, this would need to be a universe where the system of physical laws is only partially conformed to God's intellect and will, since again, if the system is fully conformed to God's intellect and will, then people would necessarily desire to be in a perfect relation with God and others. Yet, if the system of physical laws is only partially conformed to God's intellect and will, then the system of physical laws will bring about processes that only partially conform to God's ultimate intentions. This then will be a universe that has a system of physical laws that can bring about harmful processes, such as volcanoes, tornadoes, diseases, etc. The evolutionary process of creation will also be affected, since it's governed by the system of physical laws as well, and can thereby bring about animal predation. Because the system of laws is only partially conformed to God's intellect and will, the overall teleology of the universe will only partially conform to God's desires and intentions. So it operates to bring about some miracles that God desires, such as the ones that are most essential to God's plan for salvation, but it would not bring about the full panoply of miracles that would occur if the system of laws was fully conformed to God's intellect and will. Yet, once God has created all people who he plans to bring into existence, then God will fully conform the system of physical laws to his intellect and will, and bring about a new heavens and new earth that has no suffering or divine hiddenness for those who are justified to live in that universe. Note, I'm not speculating in this video on the nature of hell, which I view as a separate topic. The perfect will theodicy fits well with Romans 8, verse 20 through 21, which reads, "For the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God." Overall, I think this theodicy is plausible and has explanatory advantages over some other theodicies because it does not require the assumption that God plans all events of suffering. Oftentimes, theists feel that in responding to the problem of evil and suffering, that they must defend the claim that God plans every event of suffering in order to bring about greater goods from the events of suffering. However, This idea has been critiqued as implausible by a number of theist and atheistic thinkers alike. The perfect will theodicy, though, is a theodicy that does not require the assumption that every event of suffering is planned by God. Rather, the theodicy argues that God allows suffering in our current universe in order to lead to the greater overall good of an everlasting union between God and creatures that does not have suffering. So the theodicy is compatible with individual events of gratuitous suffering within our universe. The theodicy also is able to account for animal suffering better than most other theodicies because it accounts for why animals could have evolved predatory traits, since the system of laws that governs the evolutionary process would also not be fully conformed to God's intellect and will, and animals can thereby evolve predatory traits that they would not otherwise have evolved. Furthermore, since I'm arguing that the system of laws of our current universe is only partially conformed to God's intellect and will, the system thereby partially reflects the system of laws that God ultimately intends for the new heavens and new earth. So animals are created for our universe because God desires for them to be a part of the new heavens and new earth as well. So animals too will be a part of the afterlife, which will compensate for their suffering during this pre-heavenly universe. There are of course a number of objections that can be made to the theodicy, but it's important to keep in mind that as long as a theodicy is plausibly true, then it serves as a considerable rebuttal to the problem of evil and suffering. I'm not committed to the claim that the theodicy is necessarily true, only that it's a plausible option for people to consider. I'll now respond to some of the major objections to it. The first objection is that the theodicy entails that God is not omnipotent because it argues that God cannot fully conform the system of laws to his intellect and will without placing people into a perfect relation with God and others. However, logical impossibilities are not traditionally viewed as being in conflict with omnipotence, and I view it as being broadly logically impossible for God to fully conform the system of physical laws to his intellect and will, without also bringing about a state of affairs where people are in perfect relation with God and others. So the theodicy is not in conflict with omnipotence as traditionally understood. The next objection is that theism presupposes divine command theory, and so God can decide anything to be morally justified or not, including whether intentionally forcing people into a perfect relation with God is morally justified. In response to this concern, theism does not require divine command theory to be true, and I prefer non-natural moral realism as a meta-ethical theory over divine command theory. The next objection is that God could conform the system of laws to his intellect and will just enough so that there is not suffering, or at least not a lot of suffering, but not conform the system too much in order to avoid intentionally forcing people into a perfect relation. However, in response to this objection, if the system of laws is only partially conformed to God's intellect and will, then God does not determine every detail of how this partial conformity manifests. So, if the system is only partially conformed at all, it then opens up the possibility that the system will necessarily result in destructive processes, and the theodicy is arguing that this is exactly what does happen. The next objection is that it would be better for God to intentionally force a perfect relation with people in order to avoid so much suffering in our universe. However, in response, this objection assumes that intentionally forcing a perfect relation is something God could justifiably do. Yet, if intentionally forcing a perfect relation is an intrinsically wrong action, then God could not will such a thing, as he is a morally perfect being and can never will an intrinsically wrong thing. Next is the objection that the persons of the Trinity did not choose to be in perfect relation with one another, but rather are in perfect relation with one another by necessity. So, if the persons of the Trinity are eternally in perfect relation with one another, then it seems that God could intentionally create creatures to be in immediate perfect relation as well. In response to this worry, it should be recognized that the persons of the Trinity are all the same being who share the same ontology. The argument being made, though, is that God could not intentionally force other beings into relation with him. A related concern is about those who have died young. I believe that those who die young go straight to heaven, so are they then forced into a perfect relation with God? In response to this concern, it's important to recognize that it's not God's intention for people to die young. The theodicy being argued for is that death comes about as an indirect result of the system of laws being only partially conformed to God's intellect and will. So, under this scenario, God is not intentionally forcing the journey of those who die young into a perfect relation. And the argument is that God cannot intentionally force people into a perfect relation with Him. But if one is unintentionally forced into a perfect relation, following the moral principle of double effect, this is not God's intention, and so it's not a wrongdoing done by God. A final concern is about angels. If they started out in perfect relation with God and then had the freedom to stay with God or rebel against Him, then it seems that God could start all people out in that type of relation as well. Yet, in response to this objection, it should be noted that a traditional answer in Christian theology, going back to at least St. Anselm, is that the angels did not start out in a perfect relation with God, which is what made it possible for some of them then to have the freedom to rebel. The final objection that I will address is the concern that it seems that God does intentionally force people to exist, so why is it wrong for God to intentionally force people into a perfect relation? In response to this objection, it does not seem wrong to intentionally force people to exist, because that is the only way people can experience anything they freely desire. So that is what enables autonomy in the first place. But intentionally forcing people into a perfect relation intentionally takes away the opportunity for someone to not enter into that relation freely, and so is arguably a violation of one's autonomy. It's of course the greatest good for people to be in a perfect relation with God, but the ends do not justify the means, and if forcing someone into a perfect relation is an intrinsically evil action, then again, God cannot will such a thing. There is of course more that could be said about the points made, and more objections that could be addressed to the theodicy, but hopefully this video has explained the gist of the perfect will theodicy and how it responds to some of its main objections. Thanks for watching.